90% of the Australian population resides on just 22% of the nation's landmass. Picture 30 million individuals packed tightly within a 5-mile radius in and around London. Meanwhile, the sheer size of the Australian continent is roughly 13 times larger than France, yet its overall headcount is considerably smaller. This reality persists despite the country's high level of economic prosperity. 69% of this massive island is dominated by arid deserts and semi-desert landscapes. One might assume this harsh environment is the sole reason why the population density stands at a mere 4 persons per square kilometer. However, if we look at Sudan, 2/3 of its territory consists of similarly barren wastelands. Yet the demographic concentration there is 7 times higher than the Australian average, even with Sudan enduring continuous civil conflict. Perhaps the low demographic figures are due to the extreme distance from major European and Asian hubs. First of all, modern aviation allows travelers to fly from a European capital to the Antipodes in less than 24 hours. Secondly, the neighboring island of New Guinea boasts a population density nearly 5 times greater. Today we will uncover the historical anomalies behind the settlement and demographic patterns of the Australian continent. We will explore how this unique situation was shaped by exiled convicts, fortune hunters, fans of utopian industrial literature, advocates of obscure language dictations, aggressive Japanese forces, and modern environmentalists. The ancestors of the Aboriginal peoples arrived on these shores at least 50,000 years ago. They migrated to the ancient landmass of Sahul, which historically connected present-day Australia and New Guinea, journeying from what is now Southeast Asia by navigating shallow waters and making short sea crossings. By the time European explorers made their initial contact, the land was inhabited by diverse human groups speaking more than 200 distinct languages and forming approximately 600 separate tribal communities. The vast majority of these indigenous societies settled along the coastal fringes and river valleys, with only 1/10 of the Aboriginal population surviving in the harsh desert interior. Their survival relied entirely on hunting, gathering, and fishing, completely bypassing agricultural practices. And while they never domesticated any livestock, they were incredibly skilled at tracking wild game. Before the dawn of colonization, the total number of native inhabitants was estimated to be anywhere between 300,000 and well over 1 million individuals. Long before any officially documented discoveries, it is highly probable that Asian voyagers, including Chinese and Arab sailors, had already reached these remote shores. Cartographic materials drafted during the 16th century in the French municipality of Dieppe are frequently cited as evidence suggesting Portuguese navigators had charted the northern coastline during that era. Currently, the historical consensus attributes the formal discovery of the continent to Dutch seafarers, particularly the expedition led by Willem Janszoon, who mapped the western edge of the Cape York Peninsula. He was subsequently followed by renowned explorers such as Dirk Hartog, Abel Tasman, and several others. Nevertheless, these exploratory missions progressed sluggishly and yielded only fragmented data, leaving the massive landmass as a mysterious blank space on global maps for nearly 2 centuries. The turning point arrived with the legendary voyage of James Cook, who meticulously surveyed the eastern seaboard and officially claimed the territory for the British Crown, christening it New South Wales. Eventually, the first fleet, comprising 11 vessels under the leadership of Captain Arthur Phillip, sailed into Port Jackson Bay, effectively laying the foundational stones for the city of Sydney. Deep natural harbors, immediate oceanic access, a temperate climate, and terrain reminiscent of European landscapes transformed these coastal strips into the most logical sites for early colonial outposts. This strategic preference led to the establishment of the Yarra River Colony, which ultimately evolved into Melbourne, the Moreton Bay settlement that blossomed into Brisbane, the Swan River Outpost that birthed Perth, and the liberated community of Adelaide in South Australia. Consequently, this pattern permanently defined the nation's demographic blueprint, creating a narrow ribbon of thriving coastal metropolises surrounding an overwhelmingly desolate and uninhabited interior void. Having firmly asserted their sovereignty, the British initiated ambitious treks deep into this exceptionally arid landmass, desperately hoping to uncover hidden inland seas or vast expanses of fertile soil suitable for farming. The Scottish adventurer John McDougall Stewart successfully penetrated the geographical heart of the outback during his rigorous expedition. managing to cross the entire landmass from south to north, traveling all the way from Adelaide to the vicinity of modern-day Darwin. The intrepid explorer definitively confirmed that the interior entirely lacked substantial freshwater reservoirs, meaning only a minuscule fraction of the territory could ever support agricultural development. Up until the middle of the 19th century, these colonial settlements remained severely underpopulated. By the year 1851, the non-indigenous demographic hovered around 430,000 individuals, with roughly 80% being of British descent, comprising current inmates, emancipated prisoners, their offspring, and independent pioneers. The remaining 20% consisted of smaller migrant cohorts from continental Europe, predominantly from Germany. Simultaneously, the indigenous population was experiencing a catastrophic decline fueled by violent conflicts and newly introduced pathogens, culminating in the complete and tragic annihilation of the native Tasmanian tribes. However, a monumental event soon occurred that would multiply the number of inhabitants nearly tenfold. The ultimate turning point materialized with the serendipitous discovery of gold within the boundaries of the present-day state of Victoria. Practically overnight, the modest provincial town of Ballarat was transformed into the most prolific epicenter for gold extraction on the entire planet. This feverish gold rush acted as a powerful magnet, pulling in countless hopeful prospectors from Great Britain, mainland Europe, North America, and the Chinese Empire. Over the span of just 20 years, the total headcount quadrupled, eventually reaching an impressive 1,700,000 residents. Despite this dramatic surge, by the dawn of the 20th century, the national population remained undeniably modest when compared to global standards, harboring fewer than 4 million citizens in total. The golden era of easy surface mining had definitively concluded. At that time, securing the cheapest possible passage from London cost between 15 and 20 pounds, making the voyage roughly 3 times more expensive than purchasing a transatlantic ticket to the United States or Canada. Furthermore, mid-19th century maritime travel from Britain demanded a grueling 3 to 4 months at sea, a duration that was gradually reduced to just 6 weeks following the inauguration of the Suez Canal. On the 1st of January 1901, the 6 distinct colonial territories formally united to forge a unified federation. A newly drafted constitution was enacted, establishing a centralized national parliament, and arguably the very first piece of legislation it passed was a stringent act designed to heavily restrict incoming immigration. Strongly motivated by the utopian visions presented in John Miller's novel The Working Man's Paradise, powerful labor unions began exerting immense political pressure on lawmakers. These labor organizations vividly remembered the fierce competition during the gold rush era, when Chinese miners were willing to toil far harder and longer for significantly lower wages, not to mention the sugarcane plantations in Queensland, where laborers from the Pacific Islands broke their backs for mere pennies. Facing such relentless cheap labor, securing any reasonable wage increases seemed entirely impossible. This ultimately triggered the implementation of what became infamously known as the White Australia policy. Beyond mere economic protectionism, this legislative framework was a blatant manifestation of systemic racism, deeply rooted in the bigoted belief that Caucasian individuals possessed cultural superiority, and that racial mixing would inevitably trigger societal decay and diminish the collective intellectual capacity of the budding nation. Geopolitical anxieties also played a massive role in shaping these exclusionary border controls. Widespread paranoia regarding the so-called Yellow Peril swept the country, driven by a profound terror of demographic inundation and potential military aggression originating from densely populated Asian powers like China and Japan. Effectively banning Asian settlers was strategically viewed as a vital preventative measure to stop the formation of a hostile fifth column operating from within the homeland during times of international conflict. Concurrently, the imperial government in Great Britain strongly pressured local authorities to abandon explicitly discriminatory statutes that openly blocked the arrival of crucial allies, such as the Japanese, or loyal subjects hailing from British India. To circumvent this imperial pushback, local legislators cunningly devised an infamous dictation test, requiring any prospective immigrant to flawlessly transcribe a passage read aloud in a random European language, specifically selected by the evaluating customs officer. This bureaucratic loophole proved incredibly convenient for arbitrarily rejecting anyone deemed culturally or racially undesirable. A prime example occurred in 1934 when a multilingual Czech journalist named Egon Erwin Kisch attempted to enter the country to attend an anti-fascist convention located in Sydney. The federal administration viewed him as a highly problematic visitor due to his vocal sympathies toward radical left-wing ideologies. Consequently, the border officials maliciously selected Scottish Gaelic for his mandatory language examination. Unsurprisingly, the polyglot failed the obscure assessment, and the determined activist only managed to reach his conference after a high court intervened, officially ruling that utilizing Scottish Gaelic was an unreasonably extreme abuse of the system. Enforcing such draconian entry barriers ultimately caused the domestic economy to suffer from a catastrophic deficit of manual laborers throughout the 1920s and 30s. The subsequent global Great Depression further decimated the already dwindling stream of hopeful foreigners wishing to relocate to this distant corner of the globe. However, the outbreak of the Second World War delivered a truly terrifying shock to the isolated nation, as Japanese bombers executed well over 100 devastating aerial raids targeting the northern city of Darwin, sweeping across the western frontiers and striking deep into Queensland. Hostile Japanese submarines audaciously infiltrated Sydney Harbour itself, desperately attempting to sever critical maritime supply lines connecting the continent with Europe, Asia, and the Americas. It was during this existential crisis that the ruling political elite finally realized a horrifying truth, acknowledging that if a full-scale ground invasion were to occur, there simply would not be enough able-bodied citizens available to mount a credible defense. The local demographic stood at a fragile 7 million souls, directly facing an expansionist empire boasting over 70 million inhabitants. Consequently, in the immediate post-war era, the dramatic slogan, "Populate or perish," became a ubiquitous national rallying cry. Acting on this urgency, the pioneering Minister for Immigration, Arthur Calwell, launched a massive governmental initiative specifically engineered to rapidly import robust human capital. For the very first time in history, the restrictive borders were cautiously opened to continental Europeans of non-British origin, although rigid discriminatory barriers still firmly blocked anyone of color from establishing permanent residency. Between 1945 and the middle of the 1960s, approximately 2 million eager newcomers successfully crossed the oceans to start anew. A substantial portion of this massive influx was aggressively processed through the Bonegilla Reception Center located in Victoria, where exhausted arrivals were subjected to mandatory medical screenings before being systematically assigned by federal bureaucrats to highly specific industrial and agricultural projects. On several volatile occasions, fierce riots erupted within this austere facility, as frustrated inmates rebelled against the suffocating discipline, deplorable living quarters, and utterly inadequate food rations. It was not until 1973 that the overtly racist mechanisms of the White Australia policy were completely and finally dismantled. Since that monumental legislative shift, a steady wave of optimistic migrants has continuously arrived from diverse nations, including Vietnam, China, India, the Philippines, alongside numerous other vibrant countries situated across the Asian and African continents. Despite this inclusive shift, individuals tracing their immediate roots to these specific regions still constitute less than 10% of the current national makeup. Only 4% are recognized as citizens belonging to the original indigenous tribes, leaving the vast, overwhelming remainder of the population securely rooted in European ancestry. Today, intense domestic debates continue to rage regarding what exactly constitutes the most sustainable and optimal demographic size for the nation. Powerful corporate leaders, constantly battling frustrating labor shortages, furiously lobby the government for drastically accelerated immigration quotas. Conversely, a massive segment of the general public, backed by vocal environmental scientists, repeatedly highlights the terrifying scarcity of freshwater reserves, the extreme vulnerability of sprawling coastal metropolises to shifting climate patterns, and the already suffocating overcrowding strangling cities like Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. Pragmatic governance constantly attempts to maintain a precarious balancing act between these two completely opposing ideological viewpoints. Ultimately, the persistently low overall density of this giant island and the extreme concentration of human life clinging desperately to the oceanic fringes possess a profoundly complex, deeply rooted historical explanation. Foremost among these defining factors are severe climatic restrictions, featuring chronic water scarcity, an alarming lack of arable soil, and punishingly extreme weather phenomena. Secondly, the crushing geographical isolation from major global power centers played a monumental role, an obstacle that only truly ceased being a paralyzing disadvantage within the past 60 to 70 years. Finally, the lasting, toxic legacy of the racially motivated White Australia policy engineered demographic bottlenecks whose profound echoes are still undeniably felt throughout modern society. One might wonder whether cutting-edge irrigation technologies, revolutionary renewable energy infrastructure, and advanced transportation networks will eventually possess the power to reverse this long-standing paradigm. Could the desolate central Badlands ever witness a massive surge in permanent human habitation? It is highly improbable that any radical transformation will occur, as accelerating global warming is relentlessly rendering the already brutal interior climate even more intensely inhospitable.